This is going to be a long one. 1 page at a time. David Berry's 44-ton Volvo was barely warm when he passed Scott Guy's driveway just after 7 a.m. on Thursday, July the 8th, 2010. He'd noticed the headlights from Scott's ute 300 metres away across the paddock. It was when he wandered out to his truck and set off for work along Aorangi Road in Fielding's outskirts. They were still shining when Berry worked the gears and made his way down to his neighbour's property. The Hilux sat idling just a few metres from the road. In that instance, David Berry glimpsed his neighbour, Scott Guy, sprawled in front of his ute, spread-eagled with his arms thrown back, lying motionless. When he knelt beside Scott, David Berry felt for a pulse and got nothing. All he could see was a massive wound to his throat and blood everywhere. The first flecks of dawn were creeping across Manawatu's sky, lighting up the daffodils that lined the driveway leading up to Scott Guy's house 100 metres away from the road. David Berry stabbed at his phone and dialed 111. On the receiving end, the operator heard, "Help, my neighbour's had his bloody throat cut." In the early hours of dawn on July the 8th, 2010, 31-year-old Fielding dairy farmer Scott Guy was shot dead in his driveway as he made his way to work that morning. It was a case that absolutely captivated the nation, gathering more attention than any other case before or since. The widely distributed photo of the handsome blue-eyed Scott in a cowboy hat on his wedding day has become more recognisable to most New Zealanders than our All Blacks or any other celebrities. A massive investigation ensued involving over 100 officers and more than 2,500 interviews. And then finally, after 6 long months of what seemed like constant dead ends, the police announced a break in the case and that they had arrested somebody for the murder of Scott Guy. The identity of the accused shocked the nation, and the subsequent revelations about the charges laid against him would tear the Guy family apart. But did the police get the wrong man? Is there somebody out there in the Manawatu region who has just quietly gotten away with one of the most infamous murders in New Zealand history? Today, we are taking a deep dive into the still unsolved case of the murder of young dairy farmer Scott Guy. We'll take a look into all the conspiracies and controversies that surround the case and start to look at who else might have been responsible. I know I polled you guys over and over again asking, do you want one long video or do you want multiple parts? And you all said you wanted one long one. Thing is, I can't film one long one because I lose my freaking voice. So I tried. I really did. This is actually a cough lolly because I'm filming this intro again because I lost my voice 3/4 of the way through filming this video. So what we're going to do is 2 parts. Yay! I know you'll all be as excited as I am, but we'll do 2 parts. I promise it's going to be worth it. Trust me. Wait, how do the kids do it these days? I was going to do a love heart, but don't Gen Z do it different? I don't know. Anyway, thank you so much for your patience and understanding and supporting me. And maybe one day I can do one big long 3-hour one, but I just don't think today is that day. I'm so sorry. This happened before too. One time I tried to film like 3 videos in a row. Didn't happen. So yeah, this is going to be a long one. It is incredibly detailed. I'm very proud of this video. It's taken me, honestly, like 2 months to pull together, and I really hope you enjoy it. I think this is a very fascinating case, very interesting story, and I'm really interested to hear your guys' thoughts on it, who you think might have done it, how you feel about how the investigation was carried out. So yeah, let's discuss in the comments below. Also, if you want more content in between uploads, I do post quite frequently on my TikTok account. Usually it's obviously like much shorter content, and it's not always stuff that I cross-post here on YouTube Shorts. Most days I upload over there, and the style is quite a bit different to what I do here. So if that interests you, then feel free to head on over and check it out. Otherwise, aside from these deep dive videos that I do once or twice a month, I also do true crime book reviews. So if you're interested in that and you like reading, then go ahead and check those out and hit subscribe to be notified of new videos when they come out. Now, the majority of the research that I conducted for this case was based on information put together and published by senior investigative reporter Mike White. Among that research, I finished reading a book that he wrote about this case called Who Killed Scott Guy. I kind of briefly touched on this in my last book video, but I highly recommend this one. There has since been an updated version. I haven't read that updated version, but basically it just includes a bit of further updated information on where they are now, but we're going to cover that anyway in this video. So yeah, but thanks to Mike White, I was able to really dig deep into the step-by-step events of what was covered in the trial and gain a unique insight into the defense side of preparing for the trial, which is something that is historically not covered in any great amount of detail. And given the outcome of this trial, I think it's extremely interesting and very important to examine as well. So I will obviously, as I do with every video, list all my resources down in the description box below. So if you're keen to check out any of those works, then by all means, please do. So Scott Graham Guy was born on the 21st of December 1978 to parents Brian and Joe Guy. Scott was the eldest of 4 children with siblings Nikki, Anna, and Callum. Scott grew up on the family farm in Byreburn in Fielding, which is in the Manawatu region of the North Island. He spent much of his childhood in gumboots out on the farm helping his dad across the 372-hectare property which bordered the Oroa River. The Guy family had been farming in this area for more than 90 years, with Scott's great-great-grandparents, Cecil and Mary, beginning dairy farming on the property in 1919. All the children excelled in school. In one year, Nikki was the school president, Scott was house captain, and Anna starred as Tallulah in the school's rendition of the musical Bugsy Malone. Fun little fact. I actually participated in the local theatre production of Bugsy Malone when I was a kid as well, and I was Tallulah's understudy. Who did I play? Blossom. Blossom? Anyway. Scott was very popular and everybody described him as an all-round nice guy. His mother, Jo, described him as, quote, outgoing and gregarious. He loved animals and people. He was a real farm boy. He loved his family more than anything and didn't like injustice. Scott started at Taonui School in 1984, and his father remembers him being the first boy in the school to join the netball team. But by the time he got to Fielding Agricultural High School, it was rugby that captivated Scott's world. And despite being head boy in 1996, Scott wasn't particularly interested in school. He dropped out halfway through 7th form to go to Taratahi Agricultural Training Centre in Masterton for a year. There is something ticking. And it's annoying me. I'm worried my light's going to fall down. Afterwards, he worked in a dairy farm in the Wairarapa region of the southeast of the North Island. After that, he moved to Wellington with a girlfriend he'd met at Taratahi with ideas of life in the big city. However, Scott did struggle to find a job, and after a few months on the benefit, he was broke and hungry and tired, so he picked up the phone and called his parents, Brian and Joe, to see if there might be a job on the farm for him. Scott studied for a year at Massey University in Palmerston North, and while he didn't pass, his father Brian said, quote, he had a lot of fun, life was an adventure, and he was ready to live it to the full. Scott worked on the farm until 2002, when he moved to Australia to work on a farm near Mount Isa in the Queensland outback. He spent his time mustering cattle on horseback, which fulfills a childhood dream of Scott's of always wanting to be a cowboy. He formed a close bond with his workmates who dubbed themselves Team Delta and even got the name tattooed on their shoulder blades. When he returned from Australia in 2002, Scott was a fully fledged cowboy, complete with the hat, the chaps, the stock whip, the boots, the spurs, the works. He'd also started bull riding. Now, before he'd left for Australia, Scott had been dating a girl called Renee Matthews, and when he returned to New Zealand, they picked things up where they'd left off and began dating again, until Scott would meet Kylee Bullock. Kylee had grown up in the Hawke's Bay region, which is on the east coast of the North Island. She'd left Havelock North High School early and gone to live in Gisborne before returning back home for a while. Kylee had had a few boyfriends in the past, and in fact, one of them was so violent that she'd had to take out a trespass notice against him, or a restraining order. Kylee was just 18 and was completing her early childhood teacher training when she met Scott in a Havelock North pub after the Mohaka Rodeo where he had been bull riding. Scott and his girlfriend Renee, who he had started seeing again, had begun drifting apart by that stage, and from that night onwards, he and Kylee, inseparable. And at the time that they met, Scott was actually working in Napier, which is close to Hawke's Bay, and he was working at the Risington Breed Line, which was a sheep and beef farm. And he had his sights set on Kylee. Whenever his mum and dad would come to visit him in Napier, he told them that Kylee was the one. She was a keeper, and he knew that this was it. The search was over. However, just as the relationship between Scott and Kylee started getting serious, Scott was sadly made redundant, which meant he had to leave Napier and the Hawke's Bay region to return home to the farm in Byerburn and Fielding. So in 2003, when he returned to the family farm, he started helping out with the crops that they grew for their stock, which was way more Scott's thing. He was not really a fan of the dairy farming side of life on the farm. He was much more interested in the dry stock side of things. I have a smidge of personal experience with this. I dated somebody for a long time whose parents were farmers, and they had a dry stock farm. So it wasn't dairy farming. They basically looked after the cattle, made sure they were fed and well looked after. But my partner's brother was a dairy farmer, and that guy had no life at all. Like, his whole life revolved around dairy farming. Honestly, it must be super duper lonely. I wouldn't like to do it myself. It's incredibly challenging. It's hard enough just being a dry stock farmer, let alone a dairy farmer. So I understand that Scott was not really into it. So the idea was that on the Guy farm, Scott would be in charge of the crops and calf rearing, while Ewen Macdonald, which was Scott's brother-in-law at the time, would look after and manage the dairy side of the operation. And with Scott and Kylee, the arrangement was that Kylee would travel down to meet Scott on the weekends. But in November 2003, not long at all after Scott had moved away, Scott just decided he couldn't wait any longer, and he decided to propose to Kylee. 3 months after that, Kylee upped sticks and moved to the Manawatu region to be with Scott. And they initially lived with Scott's parents in their family home before shifting into a rental on a house that was adjacent to the farm on Airangi Road. The couple married on January 8th, 2005 at Kylie's parents' home in Hawke's Bay. Then, after the wedding, they settled into life on the farm. They had their first son, Hunter, in April 2008, and Scott was absolutely besotted. He loved being a dad. And very quickly, his whole entire reason for being revolved around his son. He would always find excuses to pop home and visit him during the day, and he would take him out on the farm with him on the quad bike whenever he could. So obviously on the surface, things on the Guy family farm looked like something out of a fairy tale. Very wholesome, very warm and cozy family life, but beneath the surface, as is always the case, things were not as harmonious and smooth sailing as you might think. Tensions had slowly started to build between Scott and Ewen. You see, Ewen had been working on the Guy farm since he was just 16 years old. Born on the 5th of June 1980 to parents Kerry and Marlene, Ewen was a typical Manawatu kid, loving the country and all the activities that it provided. The outdoors seemed to be a passion that ran through the Macdonald blood, and Ewen and his brother had spent much of their childhood outside in gumboots with their dad, digging a veggie garden or helping mow the lawns. Weekends were spent chasing pheasants across farmlands, walking around the countryside, up and down rivers, and across farmland. Ewen attributes his natural work ethic with the example set by his father. He began working from a very early age with jobs in a supermarket butchery and as well as a milk boy, which I don't know if you guys have milk boys over in the US, but we used to. You know, the kid who would drop off your fresh milk every day or every week or whenever it was. Ewen was really good at sport, in particular rugby, and he every single year would make the cut for the first 15 rugby team, and he always played position number 8. Don't know what that position is, but that's the position he played. Sorry for any rugby fans out there. So at the time of 5th form, when he was just 16, Ewen began dating Anna Guy, Scott's sister. He passed 4 subjects at school, but at this stage, he could not be less interested in academics, and he was definitely drawn to more hands-on outdoors work. Ewen himself said he was really only there to eat his lunch and hang out with Anna. And before Ewen had met Anna, he had actually previously had a girlfriend who lived on a dairy farm, and he'd always enjoyed lending a hand. So once he began seeing Anna, he would pester Brian Guy in the hopes of nabbing a job, literally any job at all, just anything that would help get him a foot in the door and get his starts working in dairy. And then Anna mentioned that one of the farm workers was leaving, so when Ewen heard that, he jumped at the chance. He embraced his new role, which was affectionately named shit kicker, with enthusiasm. Brian Guy described him as keen, diligent, and observant, good with stock and farm management. Quote, he became part of the family and we got on very well. Ewen started to develop a bit of a picture of life on the farm at Bioburn with Anna. He knew that if he just put his head down, worked hard, and learned as much as he could from Brian, that dream could very well become a reality. By 2002, Ewen had moved up the ranks to second in charge on the Guy farm. He was living in a cottage at 213 Airangi Road with Scott, who had been 2 years ahead of him at school. The pair had always been friends. They played rugby together and they would go spotlighting for possums and rabbits and often go to Himatangi Beach where Scott would surf and Ewen would bodyboard. Spotlight, for those of you who don't know, it's where you basically go literally with torches and look for animals or people in the dark at night. It was a game I used to play with my friends when I lived on a farm briefly as a child also. The two had always had very different personalities. Scott was very outgoing and confident, always the really friendly one, very popular, whereas Ewen was much more serious and reserved. When Ewen started thinking about asking Anna to marry him, it was Scott who he first consulted to see what he might think about the idea. Scott's response: he encouraged him. He said they'd been dating long enough, he might as well ask the question. He also said that he felt the couple were made for each other. So, Ewen proposed to Anna in February 2001 and they were married in November later that year. Anyway, Scott was Ewen's best man and he also organised the stag party. A fun fact too, apparently Ewen got so drunk at the stag party that the next morning he was so hungover and he woke up and swore he would never drink again in his life. And he actually kept that promise. He never ever touched a drop of alcohol ever again after that. So good for him. Ewen and Anna settled down into life on the farm in the cottage that he had shared with Scott, and the couple started to have their family. Their first child was Finn, born in 2003, followed by Jack in 2005, Lucy in 2006, and Wade in 2008. And while Scott had been busy adventuring around overseas, across the country on his various exploits, it was Ewen who had stayed at the Bioburn farm, kept his head down and managed the farm's daily operations year after year, as Brian took a bit of a step back and oversaw things at a, higher level rather than being super, super, super hands-on in the day-to-day operations. So naturally, Ewen felt that he had a pretty strong stake in the farm. So when Scott returned to the farm in 2003 and the trio began this new arrangement of Scott looking after the crops, Ewen looking after the dairy operations, and Brian overseeing the general day-to-day politics, the prospect of going into business with her brother made Anna Guy a little nervous. Quote, "I don't think three's a great number. Two's company, three's a crowd." Anna also felt that Scott had sort of sifted in and out of the farm as and when it suited him and questioned whether he was actually truly committed to it. Quote, "I thought it was quite convenient for him in between things he was doing. But, the farm paid well, and I think probably that might have been a pull rather than him loving and being passionate about the job." So Kylee Guy had really kind of struggled when she moved to Fielding. At least at first. She really wanted to return to the Hawke's Bay. All her friends and family were there. She loved the Hawke's Bay region, and honestly, Fielding does not hold much appeal. It's farming and that's it. It's there's not really much going on. So it would be a real challenge if you were moving away from your support base to the middle of nowhere. It's a big step. Kylee sort of isolated herself a little bit when she first moved down there. She would often stay at home when there were family lunches, and she did start to join later when she became a mother herself. She grew very close to a neighbour called Joe Moss, and gradually through this friendship, her homesickness did start to fade and become less prominent. Ewen always said that there was tension between Kylee and Nikki, the eldest Guy sibling, in those early days, but Kylee and Anna had more to talk about after Kylee became a mother and they had more in common. But Kylee said that, look, even if she did miss home, she would not have had it any other way. She loved Scott with all her heart and could never have stood being apart from him. She described him as one in a million. Quote, "He was my best friend, the most amazing partner and husband." Now, despite having three families living and working so closely to each other, they actually weren't living in each other's pockets, as you might expect. Kylee said they really only got together for special events because they each had their own lives and the farm was kind of work, and then you come home from work and do your own thing. Even Anna and Ewen were distant from them. The two women were friends, but the couples rarely met aside from when they'd have to work together or see each other on the farm. Ewen always said it was because Scott and Kylee had more single friends, and a typical night for him and Anna involved looking after their young children, bathing them, making dinners, putting them to bed, that sort of thing. Not to mention, Ewen would have had to wake up honestly at the crack of dawn every day for work, so you'd be having a lot of early nights. Much later, after the rivalry between the couples worsened, Anna did suggest that the couples try and have a monthly dinner, even just pizza and a film, as a way of being closer, but apparently this never happened. Kylee said she could not even remember a single occasion when Ewen would drop by for a drink. Ewen's focus was solely on his family and the farm. And this is what put him on a collision course with Scott, who, never having expressed much interest in the farm, was suddenly very keen and wanted his voice to be heard. So Scott's role on the farm in Byerburn meant that he was pretty much alone for most of the time on a tractor at the back of the farm. So he could kind of do whatever he wanted, really. And gradually, a sense grew among the other farm workers that Scott had the easier role and wasn't exactly pulling his weight. And even though it's true that Scott would work long hours at cropping time, Ewen apparently calculated that he himself was working on average 1,000 hours a year more than Scott. And yeah, that would probably piss you off. There was an external farm consultant, Simon Redman, who came in, and he noticed a stark contrast between the two, saying that Ewen was a seriously good operator, highly competent, and that the farm's success was largely owed to Ewen's efforts. However, Scott and Kylee had a much different view. Friends and acquaintances of Scott recall him describing Ewen as the useless one. So when Brian Guy sat the families down in 2006 to discuss a potential shareholding plan for the farm, you can see how such conversations could bring all of these simmering tensions to a head. Brian laid all the foundations for a healthy and constructive discussion. He hired a motel unit for a neutral space, and he even brought in an external mediator/facilitator to help assist in these discussions, which is so good. However, unfortunately, despite his best efforts, things went south pretty quickly. So the idea was that all three couples on the farm, Brian and Joe, Scott and Kylee, and Ewen and Anna, could outline their plans and hopes for the future of the farm. Scott shocked everyone, however, when he announced that he expected to inherit 100% of the farm. This was especially surprising because Scott and Kylee had never expressed this expectation before. In fact, to the contrary, they'd made it very clear that they did not see a long-term future for themselves in fielding. The plan was always to work on the farm for a while and then eventually move back to the Hawke's Bay where Kylee was from. So it did not make sense. And Brian himself apparently wondered if his son had been watching too much television, because it was definitely not the expectation that he and Scott's mother Jo had. Ever since BioBurn's inception, the Guy family had been an equal partnership with family members who came on board operations, with arrangements being carried out fairly and squarely. If one party wished to retire or leave, the other parties would buy out their shares. If you wanted to buy into shares of the farm, you had to pay. It was all done properly, above board. There was no gifting or giving of anything. It was all meant to be very fair and equal. So obviously this prompted quite heated discussion, but Brian felt that by the end of the meeting, everything had been cleared up and any idea of Scott being the sole person to inherit anything had been put to bed. Everyone agreed to discuss things further and formalize the partnership, but things did not end there. As time went on, tensions only continued to grow, with Ewen feeling that Scott, who already had the easier job of managing the crops, would rush things in order to get home sooner. He also believed that Scott was probably getting paid more than him. I don't know if that was true. Scott's sister Anna said that she felt the tensions too. She believed Scott was jealous of the family that she and Ewen had created, as well as the bond that Ewen shared with their father, Brian. Kylee, however, said that she and Scott viewed things very differently, and that Joe and Brian were giving much more help and assistance to Ewen and Anna than to her and Scott. They felt that Ewen was getting way more than Scott, despite him not actually being Brian and Joe's son. Matters worsened when the issue of the Guy family home arose. In 2008, Brian and Joe decided that it was time to downsize and move from their homestead on BioBurn into a smaller place in the township of Fielding. Given that Ewen and Anna were living on the farm on the cottage, and Ewen was the second in charge, they had 4 children. Well, at the time they had 3 children and another one on the way. It seemed logical for them to buy and move into the Guy family home. Brian and Joe did help them out. They gave them a $250,000 loan to help buy the house, but it was still given to them under the terms of having to pay back with interest, albeit pretty generous terms, but still better than, having to pay that money to the bank. This did not go down well with Scott and Kylee. They felt they'd been left out of discussions entirely and wondered why they hadn't been offered the house. In fact, they even resented Ewen and Anna for moving into the home. Apparently, Scott was also very negative about Brian and Joe moving in general, claiming that the new place in Fielding was too small, they'd paid too much, and it didn't have a spa pool, and there wasn't enough room for a cricket pitch for the grandkids. Anyway, in June 2008, the 3 couples met again to discuss how the farm should be run. Ewen and Anna and Brian and Joe were taken aback when Scott arrived with a lengthy agenda outlining his frustrations and concerns, which included how upset he felt that Ewen and Anna should get the house while he and Kylee received Nothing. Anna Guy recalled the meeting. Quote, I was quite shocked because I thought it was just a basic meeting. He was pretty fired up. He said things like, why has Anna got stuff? She's never worked a day on the farm. I was pretty hurt at the time. Scott also said that Mum and Dad should build him and Kylee a house on the farm or gift them money because Ewen and I got a sweet deal. So following Scott's outburst, the families took some time to think through their response and ultimately decided that the best approach was to put their thoughts and feelings down on paper, which Anna tearfully read out at the next family meeting. This proved productive and several decisions were reached during this follow-up discussion. It was agreed that Scott would have to start helping with milking, even though he didn't like it, in order to balance out the hours and workload between him and Ewen. Brian and Joe would help Scott and Kylee into a home, and Scott and Ewen would be paid the same salary of $100K, which, by the way, at that time, 2008, that would have been so good. That is a very, very, very good salary. The two younger couples also each took a 10% stake in the farm at a cost of $280,000 each, and that left Brian and Joe with the remaining 80%. The plan was that gradually over time, up until 2015, the couples would slowly increase their percentage shares until they'd each have 20% respectively, which left Brian and Joe with 60%. And look, Brian and Joe's intentions were always to make sure that things were divided equally and everything was fair and square. Everything they ever did was with this in mind for all of their children. And Nikki and Callum would have had the option of joining too if that was what they wanted, but it wasn't. Now you'd think that after all of this line in the sand, this clear resolution of how things were to be moving forward, that things would continue on happily. But no. Resentment continued, with Scott feeling like he wasn't listened to and that he could do a better job of running the farm than Ewen. The youngest guy sibling, Callum, remembered Scott saying he was unhappy that Ewen had shares in the farm and felt as though he was trying to take over when Scott wanted the relationship to be exclusively between himself and his father, Brian. Oh God, it's stressful just reading it. The drama, it must have been just so exhausting. And that's why you don't go into business with friends and family. I just don't think it ever ends well. Scott's sister Nikki also recalled Scott complaining about Ewen at a December 2008 concert where he drunkenly told her that he thought Ewen was the worst thing to ever happen to their family. And look, sidebar, all of this makes me honestly so sad for Anna because she was Scott's sister. She actually had literally as much right to the farm and to everything as he did. So it's like Scott forgets that Anna is even there, that she's even part of this. He's directing all this frustration and tension towards Ewen and what Ewen's getting and what Ewen's entitled to, and none of that towards the fact that his sister is also the one receiving this or partaking in this, and that she has just as much right as he does, and her children are also part of the family. So I would find that very upsetting. Anna and Ewen were very frustrated with Scott for buying baby clothes on the work card and expensing it back to the farm account. He would also apparently charge his petrol to the farm fuel card, whereas Ewen and Anna would just pay for all their own. And still, even with all of that and all of the resentment and everything, Scott was still continuing to skive off work early to go home to his son. And it seemed that tensions finally came to a head in September 2009 at a celebration held to mark the 5th anniversary of Joe and Nikki's clothing boutique that was in the township of Fielding. So earlier that day, Scott had left work on the farm early, asking another farm worker to cover for him so that he could go home and get ready for the event. Ewen was also attending the party, but he didn't have the luxury of leaving early because there was way too much to do. He was fuming that Scott left early and didn't stay, because if he had stayed, they all could have gotten through the work a lot quicker and they could have both made it to the event on time. But by the time Ewen and Anna made it to the party, it was super late and Scott was sitting down with a drink and Ewen was pissed off. He confronted Scott about his leaving early, and Scott slammed his drink down and said, quote, "I don't have to listen to this shit," and then he stormed off with Kylee and Hunter. Later, Ewen did admit that he handled the situation badly, and while Scott overreacted, it was not appropriate to discuss work matters outside of work hours, and especially not at a celebratory family event like that one. But to his credit, the next morning, Ewen took Scott aside during milking and apologised for his outburst. Now, in the background to all of this, likely adding to the tension and the resentment, was the fact that Scott and Kylee had been experiencing a number of severe and sustained vandalisms across their properties. Following the agreements on the new farm ground rules moving forward, Scott and Kylee began planning their future on the farm. This started with building their own home. Now, initially, they had planned to renovate this old wooden homestead known as the McKinnon Block at 293 Aorangi Road, but it became apparent that the place was just way too far gone and it would not really have been viable or feasible to renovate it. So instead, they decided to sell the house for removal and build something new instead. They sold it to removalists for $8,000, and in October 2008, the house was placed on trailers, all set and ready for the move. They'd been paid $2,000 up front, with the remaining $6,000 to be paid upon successful delivery. However, just before midnight on the Friday of the Labor Day long weekend, the house was set on fire and completely destroyed. And despite fire investigators being called in and extensive inquiries taking place, nobody was ever held responsible. So despite the setback, the couple set about building their new home, and by January 2009, Scott and Kylie's new home was nearing completion. On Friday the 30th of January, the builders had finished the last of the lining and everything was set and ready for the plasterers to come in on the Monday morning. But that night, the house was badly vandalized. Windows were broken, doors smashed with an axe, pipes and plumbing fittings torn out, and holes bashed in through the walls. The outside of the house also had graffiti, which was very unpleasant. I'm not going to read it aloud, but you can see the pictures displayed here on the screen. Obviously spelt very badly, and Scott and Kylee were absolutely devastated. This would have been terrifying. Can you imagine? Like, the house being set on fire. Now this, it seemed personal, right? And honestly, they seriously considered whether or not they should even stay in the Manawatu region. Kylee wanted to get the F out of there and move back to Hawke's Bay. And honestly, if it was me, I fully would have. I would have been like, you know what? Someone doesn't want me here. I'm going. But Scott convinced Kylee to stay. He bought a short pump-action shotgun for added security. Police even set up covert cameras around the property, but after 2 months, there was nothing. No further activity, nothing caught suspicious on camera, and so the police had to take them down and the offenders remained at large. In April 2009, their home was finally finished, and Scott and Kylee were able to move in and start the next chapter of their life. Now, by June 2010, life on the farm had pretty well settled down. There hadn't been any more vandalism since the destruction of their home in January 2009, and Kylee was even 6 months pregnant with their second son. Scott and Ewen were even getting along well, and towards the end of June, the pair had attended a conference together in Invercargill, and according to Scott's sister Nikki, the brothers-in-law had a fantastic time. They shared a room at the Moana Court Motel, ordered pizza, watched a film, and on another night, apparently they got KFC together. They split up the seminars and shared notes afterwards. Kylee also said that when Scott came back from the trip, he was in good spirits, he was upbeat. He said that Ewen had opened up to him and the pair had sorted through a lot of their issues. Anna also saw a difference in Ewen. She said he was a lot more positive and didn't complain anywhere near as much as he usually did. He enjoyed having more time with her and the kids, and it seemed they had struck a balance at last. And then one horrible, horrible morning, the Guy and Macdonald families' lives would come crashing down around them. The family was torn apart by a tragedy so horrific and unthinkable that it would challenge everything they thought they knew about each other. The morning of the 8th of July 2010 began like any other. Scott rose early that day, probably at around 4 a.m. He was on the early shift and was due to start work at 4:50 a.m. He took off his wedding ring, as he did each morning. He never wore it whilst farming, it's dangerous, and got dressed on the other side of the house so as not to wake Kylee and Hunter. He made himself a cup of coffee, he flicked through Facebook, checked his emails, and then browsed the MSN News website before heading off to work. His last known keystroke was at 4:41 a.m. Just an important note, Scott was chronically late, despite living just 1.5 kilometres down the road from the milking shed. And whilst we know his last keystroke, we don't actually know how long it took him to head out the door after that, or how long he actually stopped to read the news on the screen. Just an important note to keep in mind for later. In his silver Hilux with the personalised plates Mr. Guy, he picked a song on his iPod and headed off down the driveway to work. But as Scott made his way down the driveway that stretched 100 metres from his house to the road, he was stopped by the main gates. They were both shut, which was extremely unusual because the gates were always left open. And if they were going to be shut, it would have been Scott that shut them. But he didn't do that. He didn't remember doing that, so it was odd. So Scott climbed out of his ute to go and open the gates, probably wondering who would have closed them between the time that he and Kylee and Hunter returned home the previous night and now. He walked out in front of his ute, silhouetted by the headlights in the wee dawn hours. He first swung the right-hand gate open. It was stiff from lack of use and movement and really only just cleared the driveway. The left-hand gate had dropped slightly and he had to actually lift it up, pick it up, in order for it to be moved out of the way. Scott was midway through lifting the second gate when a shadowy figure stepped out of the darkness at an estimated 4:43 a.m. He would not have seen his assailant hiding in the wings of the pitch black, and nobody knows what, if anything, was said between the pair. But the gunman pointed a shotgun at Scott and fired 1, 2, and possibly even 3 shots into his face and neck. Scott collapsed backwards on the driveway in front of his still idling ute. He lay spread-eagled on his back with his arms flung above his head. His body was lit up by the beams of his truck's headlights. The killer then walked over to Scott's body, around his head, to make sure that Scott was actually dead. And then he fled the scene. It's almost certain that Scott would have died instantly, with the wound to his neck being so severe that nobody could have survived it. He had sustained at least 2 shotgun blasts at close range, estimated between 2 to 6 meters away. The first shot destroyed his voice box, with pellets coming to rest in his upper chest, and it tore a 13 centimetre hole in his neck. His jaw shattered as pellets passed through his mouth and eye socket and into his brain. The second shot struck Scott's face and arms, possibly as he was falling back from the first blast. The forensic team that examined Scott's body said that it was possible Scott had his arm up to try and see who his assailant was in the darkness. Meanwhile, at the milking shed, Ewen had expected Scott to be there, as it was his turn to do the early start that morning. When he didn't arrive, Ewen and the other workers just assumed that Scott must have slept in because this was not uncommon for Scott. Ewen even made the joke to the other farm workers, Simon Asplin and Matthew Ireland, quote, "Sleeping Beauty strikes again." At 5:03 a.m, Ewen sent a text to Scott asking him, "Are you up?" He then headed off to the milking shed with Matthew and Simon, knowing that although they had a lot to do, they could manage without Scott until he arrived. By 5:40 a.m, there was still no sign of Scott, so Ewen tried to phone him, but he got no answer. It was a busy morning, and there were 300 cows that needed milking, so Ewen decided to give up on Scott and figured that he would just deal with him later. Just before 7 a.m. that morning, neighbour and truck driver David Berry was making his way to work down Airangi Road when he noticed Scott's headlights shining 300 metres away. As he moved his 44-ton Volvo down the road, he wondered what Scott was up to, because this was unusual. He passed 293 Airangi Road and was momentarily blinded by the Utes' headlights. But then he suddenly picked out Scott's boots and body lying in the driveway. Berry slammed on his brakes so hard they left skid marks on the road, and he leapt out of his ute to attend to Scott. When he saw all the blood, he tried to check for a pulse, but Scott was lying cold with his eyes open, and there was just blood everywhere. At first, when he saw the injury to Scott's throat, he assumed that Scott must have had his throat cut. At 7:08 a.m., David Berry phoned 111 and told the operator, quote, "I need the police here too. My neighbour has had his bloody throat cut. He's just lying there cold. He's dead, I think. Probably a knife by the look of it." The operator asked if it was possible to perform CPR, to which David Berry replied, "No, he's past that by the look of it." The next concern was that the killer might still be on the loose, since nobody knew when this had actually occurred, so the operator instructed Berry to get back inside his truck and lock the doors until police could arrive. While he waited for emergency services, David called his landlord, Bruce Johnston, who lived 500 metres away and was just tucking into a bowl of porridge when his phone rang. Bruce, along with his partner's son, Ashley Hislop, arrived on a quad bike just moments later. Johnston walked within 2 metres of Scott and could tell instantly that he was dead. Johnston checked with Berry, and they decided that the best person to call would be Ewen. He would know what to do in this situation. At 7:16 a.m, Ewen had just finished hosing down the milking shed when Bruce Johnstone phoned. Quote, "Ewen, is that you? Something has happened to Scotty. There's been an accident. He's dead." "He's dead, mate." Ewen replied, "What? You're joking." Bruce told him, "You've got to come down here, mate." The first 2 police cars arrived on the scene and very quickly established that Scott was dead and that there was nothing that paramedics could do for him. When a paramedic arrived shortly after, he confirmed that and also confirmed, for the record, the death. Ewen had followed the police cars up Airangi Road on his quad bike. He was still dressed in his milking gear of green overalls, fleece jacket, brown gumboots, having literally just come from the milking shed as soon as he received the call. Others who were at the scene said that Ewen seemed very visibly distressed and obviously upset. He tried to approach Scott, but he was stopped by the police, who said that this was now a crime scene and he couldn't go any further. Then Ewen alerted the police to the fact that Hunter and Kylee were probably still asleep inside the house and that they should really go check on them. Police were also aware and alert to the fact that should the killer still be in the area, Hunter and Kylee could very well be in danger. Back inside Scott's house, Kylee had just woken up and was watching TV with Hunter when she heard the hum of four-wheelers, which are also known as quad bikes. Hunter thought that it was his dad coming home to see him and yelled out, "Daddy, bike!" Kylee looked out the window and was alarmed when she saw police cars at her gate. She grabbed a coat and with Hunter on her hip, she went outside to see what was going on. 2 police officers, one armed with a rifle, were halfway up the drive when Kylee opened the front door to leave the house. They yelled at Kylee to stay where she was, worried that she might see the bloodied body of her husband. When they reached her, they told her that there had been an accident and that it was serious. Kylee, who was heavily pregnant at the time, slumped to the ground instinctively, knowing that Scott was dead. Officers led her and Hunter back inside, and at 7:21, Ewen made the call that nobody ever wants to make. Ewen phoned Brian Guy, who was in the town of Fielding at the time in their new house, but he could barely even speak. The short, incoherent conversation lasted only 22 seconds, and all Brian heard was that something had happened to Scott, something about his face, and that he needed to get there as soon as possible. Joe Guy was at the local swimming pool at the time, so Brian just had to speed to the scene alone. In his daze, he mistakenly went to the milking shed first before realizing that he needed to go to Scott's house and working his way back. When he arrived, Ewen met him at the scene and told him that someone had killed Scott. Dazed and in shock, Brian's attention immediately turned to Kylee. Police gave him permission to hop the fence and go to the main house to sit with Hunter and Kylee, and also, tragically, to confirm the worst news, that Scott was dead. He comforted them as best he could while trying to navigate his own grief before, at 7:47 a.m, picking up the phone and ringing his wife and Scott's mother, Jo. When Jo had arrived home that morning from her laps at the swimming pool, the lights were on, the garage door was open, but Brian was gone. She thought it odd that he had just taken off in a rush somewhere. She was just stepping out of the shower when the phone rang. Brian told her that there had been a tragedy and that something had happened to Scott. Jo raced to Airangi Road, crying all the time and feeling unable to breathe. She was stopped at the cordon and told that she couldn't go any further. Ewen arrived to greet her and was crying and was hugging her, saying it was terrible and that this should not have happened. Jo then phoned her eldest daughter, Nikki, who arrived crying and swearing at 8:15 that morning. Back in the main farmhouse, meanwhile, Anna, totally unaware of what had happened, was helping her young children to get dressed when she heard a banging on the front door. It was Nikki. She burst in, yelling that Scott was dead and that he'd been shot. Anna listened in disbelief and confusion, but then the rest of the Guy family showed up, as none of them were allowed past the cordon and they didn't really know what else to do or where to go. Everybody gathered in the kitchen in a chaotic huddle of hugs and tears and just pure heartbreak. Back at the murder scene, police arrived for what would become one of New Zealand's most infamous murders of all time. But investigators weren't to know that in the 5 days they spent combing the area in protective white overalls, boot covers, and gloves. They searched every inch of the driveway, the adjoining paddocks, and the roadside for any clues or anything that could possibly point them in the direction of who might have done such a heinous thing. The officer in charge of the scene was Detective Glenn Jackson from Palmerston North CIB. He arrived at the scene at about 9:50 a.m, and after being briefed, he began to examine the crime scene himself. Scott's ute was still idling in the driveway at this time, and Jackson noticed that although the gates to the property were open, the left-hand gate wasn't fully opened or fully back, so that told him that Scott had probably been in the process of opening it at this time. But there was one other key detail that immediately stood out to Jackson. There were distinctive footprints around the scene leading right up to where Scott's body lay. They had a wavy pattern sole, and these footprints were also found in a paddock leading up to a woolshed where Scott and Kylee housed their family Labrador, who was nursing a litter of pups at the time. Forensics took careful castings of the footprints, more than 60 in total, and these were sent to ESR, which is the Environmental Science and Research Facility, for testing. And these boot impressions would turn out to be one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Now, despite knowing that Scott had been shot at least twice, investigators were only able to recover a single shotgun wad and no shotgun shells. However, remarkably, 2 days into the crime scene investigation, a second shotgun wad was discovered along the fence line where countless forensic team members had been combing through over the last couple of days. Police claimed that the wad must have somehow been covered by the tent that was put up to cover Scott's body after the shooting, but photos taken the day that Scott was killed and before the tent was erected shows white-suited officers pouring over the ground near where the second wad was found, and even once the tent was erected, it still stood well clear of the fence line, so that didn't go anywhere, that argument. And official police photos of the wad, supposedly taken at the time it was found, show it sitting on top of the grass in a very obvious position. There's no way that it could have been overlooked. So it seems incomprehensible that investigators didn't notice it during the days that they spent combing that fence line, especially when, in more than one instance, individual shotgun pellets measuring just millimeters across had been found around the crime scene. So how could they miss a shotgun wad, which was several centimeters long? It didn't really make sense. Suspicions remain that somebody involved in the investigation may have accidentally stood on the wad and pressed it into the mud because it was very wet and it had been very muddy at the time, and then realizing what they'd done and finding it, picked it up and placed it so it looked as though it had been found where it was. And forensics did support this theory because it said that the wad had been muddied and appeared trodden on. In any case, it's embarrassing for police because they either didn't notice a giant wad that was out in plain sight for all to find, or they stood on it and placed it themselves. So the case immediately gripped the nation, but it only grew in infamy when the day after Scott was killed, Ewen discovered that 3 of the Labrador puppies were missing when he went to feed them. There should have been 7 after Scott and Kylee recently gifted the 8th pup to Joe Moss, Kylie's close friend, and the couple had put flyers up around the town advertising the pups for sale at $700 each. Before going to bed the night before, Scott had fed the litter and all 7 pups were there, which means that the 3 missing pups had to have been taken sometime between when he fed them last and went to bed and when Scott was killed, because by the time David Berry noticed his body, nobody would have been able to pass through that scene and take the puppies. So, small window of opportunity. Police issued a media statement asking for help in locating the puppies, and the response was overwhelming, with potential sightings literally up and down the country. But unfortunately, none of those leads panned out. How is one supposed to differentiate one chocolate lab puppy from literally every other chocolate lab puppy in existence? Do you know what I mean? How do you know that that was the chocolate lab puppy? You know? They literally all look the same. So I'm not really sure how the general public were supposed to know if it was a stolen pup or not. Anyway, the response did, however, highlight just how engaged the nation was in this investigation and how willing they were to help the police find the culprit. Scott's body was released by the police on the Monday following his murder and taken to his parents' house for the funeral. More than 1,000 people packed out Fielding's Anglican Church as his coffin arrived on the back of his ute, surrounded by friends in cowboy hats like Scott's. His friends from Australia carried him into the church, while his family, including Ewen Macdonald and Kylie's sisters Jessica and Chanel, carried him out. During the service, Kylee had a heartfelt letter that she had written to Scott read out by her uncle Rowan Bullock. Quote, "To my beautiful husband, you are my everything. From the first time I met you, I was so in love with you. We had a love that some people search for their whole lives. I don't know how I'm going to get through this, and I remember we were always going to die in each other's arms, exactly like the movie The Notebook. Now, I'm not scared of death. I have the greatest reason for living. I can't wait to see you again." Scott's father, Brian, and his 2 sisters, Nikki and Anna, and his brother Callum also spoke at the service. As Scott's coffin was carried from the church, covered in flowers, a group of Australian jackaroos cracked their whips in a guard of honour. On the 20th of July, Kylee and the Guy family made a tearful public plea for anybody with information to come forward and assist with the investigation. Kylee told journalists that her life had been ruined by the murder of her husband. Quote, "What they've done is they've ruined our lives. They've taken a wonderful, beautiful father away from his children, his sons. Hunter is lucky enough to have had that time with him, but our baby will never, ever meet his daddy." Kylee said that the hardest part was that their 2-year-old son, Hunter, still asked for his daddy every single day, especially first thing in the morning. And at the time of the press conference, Kylee was just 4 weeks away from giving birth to their second son. So in addition to the missing pups, there were 2 other major lines of inquiry that police were following. One of them being the possibility of a burglary gone wrong, and the other that the killing was drug-related. But despite an extensive investigation and a suspect list more than 60 people long, police still didn't have anybody who stood out as being their prime suspect. There had been searches, roadblocks, flyers, and thousands of interviews. Police had methodically sifted through countless witness statements, pieces of potential evidence, and hopeful leads from the public. They also considered claims from several people who said that they believed perhaps they were actually the intended target and that Scott's murder was a mistake. Oh yeah, and the psychics came out of the woodwork too, of course. Now, I have very, 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 very strong thoughts on psychics inserting themselves in crimes and murders. I'm actually working on a video at the moment about that exact topic, so stay tuned. Of course, to nobody's surprise, none of the psychics' leads panned out. Now, investigators considered putting up a reward for information, and members of the public had even offered to fund this. 2 months after Scott's death, Kylee gave birth to their second son, Drover. Following this, she pleaded with officers to please make an offer, put up a reward for information so that they could solve this crime. But police chose not to. They were concerned that a cash reward might elicit a flood of speculative money hunters whose claims could divert police from the investigation's focus. And yet, the days, weeks, and even months ticked by with what seemed to be no progress, and the Guy family approached their first Christmas without Scott. There was the sense that police were totally at a loss. But all that would change in the new year as police sat down to reassess where they were at with the investigation. Now, I just want to take a moment to truly acknowledge the world of pain that Kylee Guy must have been going through at this time. To give birth to their second child just 2 months after the love of her life was shot dead in their driveway, a moment that is supposed to be so joyous and full of love that should be shared with her husband. I cannot imagine how overwhelming and probably traumatic that experience must have been for her. That woman has truly been to hell and back. And although this video is super long, we don't really spend much time dwelling on what it must have actually been like for the Guy family. And so I just want to stop and acknowledge the impact that this horrible, horrible, horrible crime has had on the lives of so many. It's truly the butterfly effect. Like, that moment that Scott was killed has just ripped a hole through the lives of everybody who knew him, in particular his family and his wife and children. Kylee has my utmost respect, as does the rest of the Guy family, who have all held themselves with such dignity and grace despite going through, honestly, the worst thing that anyone could ever imagine experiencing in their entire lives and in the public eye. So before we carry on, just let that be known. So at the beginning of 2011, new information had all but dried up and all existing leads had been exhausted. By December 2010, the month prior, the investigation team had reduced from 40 to 24 and then again to just 14 in January 2011. The police had to admit to the media that they were honestly still scratching their head over who was responsible for Scott Guy's murder. So, given this, lead detective Sue Schwalger sat down with her team to examine where the investigation was at, what they had, and where they needed to direct their focus next. They decided to shift the focus of the investigation to what they called previous incidents phase, which included looking closely at those who may have had beef with Scott. They also formed a strong belief that the vandalisms carried out on Scott and Kylee's properties were probably linked to his murder, which was a view shared by most, and in my extremely unqualified opinion, seems like the most logical place to start with a murder investigation anyway. It seems really weird to me that they didn't start with those that might have had a reason to kill him. I don't know what they would do. Literally, what were they doing that whole time? What were they doing for those months? I don't know. Am I being stupid and naive? Am I missing something? Why wouldn't you start with that? Interestingly, ironically, Ewen Macdonald, Ewen's father, told police 2 weeks after the murder that his gut feeling was that there was some connection with the vandalism. As police began to look into people who may have had issues with Scott, unsurprisingly, Ewen's name popped up over and over again as multiple people reported the years-long friction that existed between the pair. Now, at the same time that they began to take notice of Ewen, police decided to, who had, until that point, very carefully drip-fed information to the public, they decided to release a few details of the vandalism against Scott and Kylie's house, which included photos of the graffiti on the walls in the hopes that maybe somebody might recognize the handwriting and come forward. What they got in response was explosive. So investigators received a tip from a man who claimed he believed the handwriting to be that of his former employee, Callum Bow. Apparently, when he saw the photos of the graffiti in the newspaper, he immediately reached for old timesheets that Callum had completed for him in comparison, and he thought it was a match. So who was Callum Bow? Well, Callum had been orphaned young and raised by his grandparents. The Guy family wanted to help him out, and so they took a teenaged Beau under their wing and gave him a job on the farm. During the time that he worked on the farm, Callum and Ewen formed a very close friendship. They would tramp together. They even took a helicopter hunting trip in the King Country, which is sort of past the Waikato region. So even after Callum left the farm in 2007 to pursue an apprenticeship, he and Ewen remained in touch and stayed friends. In March 2010, Callum moved to Queenstown to be closer to his brother and to take up a building job. So following the tip about the handwriting, police began to look into Callum in particular, taking a look at his movements around the time of the vandalisms. They also looked at how Callum's movements and the vandalism times might have fitted with Ewen's movements. Now, when questioned, both Callum and Ewen admitted to poaching deer on a farm owned by a man called Graham Sexton, and on occasion at a farm near Taihape, but they vehemently denied any involvement in the crimes against Scott and Kylee, and they offered an alibi to prove it. The pair claimed that at the time of the vandalisms carried out against Scott and Kylee, the two were driving up the North Island to deliver furniture for a former farm worker. But when police went to confirm their story, their phone and bank records contradicted this. At the time they claimed to be heading towards Ruakaka in the North Island, EFTPOS transactions showed that they were actually still in Fielding around the time that the vandalism is believed to have occurred. And then phone records showed a call between the pair just before the arson of the old house was discovered. This was at a time that Ewen claimed to have been asleep. Now, up until that point, both men had been extensively interviewed by police, but investigators didn't really have any reason to think that they had anything to do with the murder until it surfaced that Callum, who had previously denied any involvement in the vandalisms, had bragged to his workmates about the crimes he committed with Ewen, which included the poaching and the burning down of an abandoned house. Armed with this new information, on Saturday the 2nd of April 2011, police flew to Queenstown to have a little chat with Callum. When they knocked on his door, Callum answered and said that he wasn't surprised to see them. He had thought that they'd probably want to chat with him further. The police took him to Queenstown Police Station, and once they got there, Callum spilt his guts and told them everything. He admitted that he and Ewen had torched the house that Scott and Kylee were planning to move. He also said that they'd taken to Scott and Kylee's new house with an axe and the obscene graffiti. He said that they had shot and stolen 2 trophy stags from a nearby deer farm and had poached deer on Graham Sexton's farm on multiple occasions. When they'd been caught poaching on Graham Sexton's farm, they retaliated by dumping 16,000 litres of milk from a vat and burning down his 110-year-old duck shooting hut known as the whare. They also killed 19 calves on a neighbouring farm with a hammer. Callum was just 21 at the time, and he did his darndest to throw Ewen under the bus for the lot of it. He claimed that he was much less culpable as he was younger than Ewen, and he had been intimidated by Ewen and was just going along with what Ewen wanted to do. However, it is interesting to note that Callum claimed that Ewen is the one that did the graffiti, but it was Callum's handwriting that was identified as a match, and also Callum had notoriously bad spelling, and so did the graffiti. But anyway, towards the end of the interrogation, Callum made one final explosive claim, which is that he believed Ewen was responsible for Scott Guy's murder. Quote, "I think that Ewen Macdonald shot Scott Guy, and that's just spinning in my head. And it's just a theory that is like my gut telling me that." And in the words of Brazos, aka Charles, aka Steve Martin from Only Murders in the Building, this sends the investigation into a whole new direction. Suddenly, the tensions between Scott and Ewen took on a far more sinister light. Ewen Macdonald no longer appeared as the hard-working family man who didn't drink or smoke and coached his kids' rugby team, but a man fueled by hatred and driven to exact revenge. Someone who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity with the secretive nighttime missions, as he and Callum referred to them, as speaking to Ewen's character, someone who was capable of carrying out violent crimes under cover of darkness. The police were convinced that they had their man. On Thursday, the 7th of April, 2011, the police showed up at Ewen Macdonald's house just as he was sitting down to eat his breakfast. They asked that he accompany them down to the station for further questioning. At 9:20 a.m., they settled into a small interrogation room. Ewen declined to have a lawyer present. He didn't think he'd need one. And listen, this is a note to everybody watching this, because whether you are guilty or innocent, you do not have to speak, okay? And this is, listen, I'm especially talking to you if you're innocent and you are being painted into a bad light. Don't say anything. Just get a lawyer. Don't say anything. Saying more is not going to help your case, because we see so many people go down, sometimes for things they didn't do because they didn't know that they didn't have to talk. You don't owe the police anything. Anyways, back to Ewen. He and Callum had already previously admitted to the poaching, and they'd both received minor convictions for these. So as the interview kicked off, Ewen would explain to police how their night missions would usually pan out. Then for several hours, Ewen repeated his alibis, but eventually police confronted him with the contradictory evidence from his phone and FPOS records around the time that the arson and the vandalisms occurred.
So did you go and do that damage to the house?
No, I didn't. No.
Do you know anything about that?
No.
When we spoke to your dad, I mean, like you say, you spoke to him and stuff. His theory was that if we find a person responsible for the damage, and if we find a person responsible for the arson, and then we'll find the person responsible for the murder. What's your view on those sorts of things?
I guess so. Like, it sort of makes sense. It's all sort of aimed. It's been aimed at Scott and Kylee, isn't it?
Yeah. It's just, it seems clear to me that you guys were there at the time that damage was caused. Right. You've made us think that wasn't actually the case. You know what I mean?
I don't. It was deliberate. Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah. Intentional. Okay. Well, when that first statement was taken, man, there was so many things going through my head.
I just think that it was pretty important, the damage, and it always has been.
Yeah.
Because we think that the arson and the damage are linked to the murder, and when you offer the opportunity to give an explanation, you offered up that you left on Friday and came back on Sunday, which basically puts you out of there for the whole time that damage was happening.
Yeah, well, I think I put in my statement though, like I couldn't remember exactly when it, I'm not sure what.
But at 10:57 p.m, Callum Bow calls you in a call that lasts 9 seconds, and both of your phones polled in Highfield Road Fielding. So it was a call that was connected and lasted 9 seconds.
Highfield Road Fielding.
Highfield Road Fielding, yeah.
That's up where Brian is, isn't it?
That's just where it polls.
Oh, okay. So
that's just where it polls. I'd say that's where you are.
Oh, okay.
That's where the cell site is. So what I'm saying is that you're both in Fielding.
Yeah.
This is on the night of the night of the arson. This is at 3 minutes to 11 p.m. Callum Bow phones you and a call that lasts
9 seconds.
Explain
what 9 seconds. I wouldn't even know that. Did I answer it? 9 seconds.
It's a positive call.
Oh, okay.
It's been.
I can't remember. At 11 o'clock at night. Yeah, right.
So I guess what I'm saying is that
he's
fire service attended that. They got a call about midnight. So
right.
About an hour before it's actually a call. So it's a call that's been called and answered.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although it only lasted 9 seconds.
Yeah.
I just really wanted to.
I'll nut out all these fine details.
I mean, it's really concerning for me.
That's concerning for me too. Yeah.
Been in Fielding at a time when we clearly thought that you said you're away, so it'd be good to get that sorted out.
Then on the interrogation footage, you can see that Ewen becomes noticeably restless and uncomfortable. He strips his jumper off and downs an entire bottle of water. After nearly 5 hours of questioning, Ewen still hadn't stopped talking or still hadn't asked for a lawyer. The police finally revealed that they had spoken to Callum and that he had told them everything. Finally, Ewen admitted his involvement after years and years of lying. He confessed to the arsons, the vandalisms, poaching, dumping of milk from the vat, killing of the calves. And when asked why by the police, he honestly didn't really have a good answer. Said that it was just a bit of fun and that shooting the stags was a challenge. The attack on Scott and Kylie's house was, quote, mindless stupidity. Ewen did suggest that he held a little bit of a grudge against Scott and felt that the farm partnership was unfair, but despite finally owning up to all of the horrible crimes he did commit, he staunchly denied any knowledge of or involvement in Scott's murder. Quote, it looks obvious, these leading up to event, but, I'm not that blimmin', I'm not a psycho. Police pushed and encouraged Ewen to confess, saying that he had nothing left to lose, but Ewen remained strong in his conviction that he did not do it. Quote, I wouldn't take someone's life, I've never been that extreme. Police urged him again, saying he was the only logical suspect, to which Ewen responded, quote, you can see the finger points at me. I'm in a bad situation. Yeah, but I had nothing to do with that. I'm not the murderer. I'm not guilty. But the police weren't having any of it. Ewen was arrested and charged with the crimes he had admitted to, and then later that evening, the police returned to arrest him and charge with Scott Guy's murder. When asked if he wanted to say anything, Ewen just responded, nah. When Ewen's father, Ewen Macdonald, found out that his son had been arrested, he was shocked, and he asked the lead investigator, Sue Schwalger, what he should do next. Did she have any advice? Were there any support channels that they could reach out to? And he said she was just kind of stunned, like it had never ever before occurred to the police that the arrested party's family might need support as well. Kerry said that that was the first clear delineation between the us and them that existed between the defence and the prosecution. On the other hand, the Guy family and Kylie's family, the Bullocks, had nothing but good things to say about the police. They said that they felt endlessly supported, as they should be in that situation. Even so, this was the first of what would be many occurrences where the Macdonalds were left basically floundering. Anna Guy later recounted how the moment that Ewen was arrested was also the moment that their marriage ended, even if she didn't realize it at the time. Quote, "The day Ewen was arrested, it was like he died too. I wasn't allowed to see or talk to him for about 2 weeks. I couldn't ask him what the hell's going on, what's happened. I had never really been on my own before, so it was a huge shock, and even harder to be left with 4 children and no explanation. I remember being so scared. I had to stop thinking about everything at once. I decided to concentrate solely on the kids and set up routines for us to try to get on with each day. I look back now and there's no way I would have been able to cope otherwise. If I had thought of everything at once, I probably would have had a breakdown." After he was arrested, that's when Ewen finally decided to call a lawyer, and he contacted Peter Coles, who was a local fielding lawyer and had known the Macdonalds for years. He'd also known the Guy family for years because Fielding is a small place. The next morning, Ewen's brother Blair, who was a detective with the Wellington police, contacted high-profile defence lawyer Greg King. Blair had been informed by the Palmerston North police of his brother's arrest, and he'd promptly told Ewen not to, quote, "say a fucking thing." But of course, by that point, it was too late. And I don't know why Ewen, with a brother who worked in the police, didn't ask for a lawyer sooner or call his brother. But anyway, the Palmerston North police did do Blair a solid because they phoned him to inform him before the news got out because they felt that, you know, from one cop to another, it might be nice for them to let him know. So that was kind of a decent thing that they did. But anyway, Greg King had a reputation as one of the country's top defence lawyers. He had been involved in several high-profile, prominent cases, including Scott Watson, who was convicted of killing Ben Smart and Olivia Hope, the samurai sword attacker Anthony Dixon, Bruce Howes, who stabbed his 2 stepdaughters, and Clayton Weatherston, who murdered Sophie Elliott. Now, I have made a video about the Sophie Elliott case if you are interested in that terrible story, but I do want to warn you that it's a very, very harrowing one, so just watch with caution. So Greg King met with Macdonald at the Palmerston North police station the following morning, and after speaking with him and speaking to Ewen's parents, he promised that he would do everything he could to help their son. And he told Kerry that they were going to get him home. Marlene Macdonald, Ewen's mother, remembers exactly what Greg King said to her, quote, "Your boy hasn't done this and we'll get your boy home." By the time they got to the courthouse at 1:30 p.m. later that day, it seemed like every single person from the media in the entire country had heard about what happened and had flown in for the event. Greg King recalls that, quote, "I had no idea the level of interest and started wondering what I'd got myself into." So right from day one, the defense was on the back foot, up against prejudice and very limited resource. I have a huge problem with the way that trials are conducted in our country and what's considered a fair trial, because in New Zealand, yes, we have legal aid, so you're entitled to a lawyer. One will be appointed to you, so a public defender, but you don't really get to choose that public defender. Legal aid is notoriously hard to get any money from. It can take months, and yet the Crown has unlimited resource, unlimited police officers, unlimited money to run tests and do analysis and look at evidence, and the defence has to scrimp and save for everything. So I do not think we can anywhere near call that a fair trial. And Ewen's defence team were up against a seemingly unwinnable case, and the playing field could hardly be considered fair right from day one in this story. Even though the defendant is presumably innocent until proven guilty by a court of law, it's the defendant who has to foot up the bill, scrimp, beg and borrow for every dollar and every hour. And the inequality of this is something that had long irked Greg King. He'd come up against it in several cases throughout his career, and felt it particularly with Ewen's case. Police had had months to build their case against Ewen and hours to go through every single piece of evidence, but the defense is on the clock from the moment the accused is arrested because a trial date will be looming and they have to make sure they can build a robust defense in a limited amount of time. So adding to this challenge as well was that in the crucial lead up to the trial, Greg King was set to be out of the country for 2 months on a prestigious fellowship in the United States. He was due to arrive back in the country just a fortnight before the trial was supposed to begin. Peter Coles held down the fort in Greg's absence, and he honestly did an absolutely phenomenal job of pulling together a defense in less than ideal circumstances. He was aided by novice lawyer Liam Collins, who King had employed less than a year earlier. He had been so impressed by Collins, who had completed a task sifting through a bunch of papers on the Scott Guy Ewen Macdonald case in 2 days when it should have taken a week, that Greg King decided to keep him on. The defense also hired a private investigator, former detective Paul Bass. So as if all of these factors weren't enough of a challenge and Greg King being out of the country, the police seemed hell-bent on making the defense's life as difficult as possible, to the point where it could almost be interpreted that they were intentionally hampering the defense's efforts by withholding discovery and making it virtually impossible to sift through when they did eventually hand it over. The electronic copies of the discovery that were requested by the defense were not searchable or even initially printable. So there is 40,000 pages of discovery in the Guy trial. Being unable to do a keyword search on a PDF would make this task virtually impossible. The process of handing over discovery became so bad that Greg King actually threatened to file for an adjournment of the trial date due to the setbacks. Just 1 month out from the trial, the prosecution and police still hadn't provided any searchable formats, and Peter Coles, Liam Collins, and Paul Bass were beyond frustrated and, quite frankly, appalled at the way that they had been intentionally kept in the dark. Paul Bass said that if it wasn't intentionally obstructive, the police and Crown, their actions were utterly unprofessional. He said that in his 15 years as an investigator, he had never experienced a case where a month out from a major trial, the defense still hadn't received adequate searchable files from the police. Quote, "Unfortunately, the police on occasion do lose sight of what their role is and the fact they're the investigative arm of the judiciary. At times, they get a tunnel vision approach, and having that tunnel vision means anybody that disagrees with you, they consider to be the enemy. So they're not overly helpful towards the enemy as they perceive it to be." And unbelievably, these difficulties in obtaining discovery and evidence persisted even into the trial as it began. The most glaring instance of police withholding information, perhaps, is when the defense got wind that the police had actually bugged Ewen Macdonald's phones. To do so required a search warrant from a judge and is a fundamental part of any inquiry that must be disclosed by police. Peter Coles was so incredulous that this information wouldn't have been disclosed to them that he honestly could hardly believe it was even true. When Coles demanded from police to know why they hadn't been told about it, the police confirmed that, yeah, they had bugged Ewen Macdonald's phone. They just somehow forgot to tell the defense about it, on whose shoulders Ewen Macdonald's entire freedom rested, but okay. So it turns out that Ewen Macdonald's phones had been bugged for 8 days the year prior to his arrest. Police claim that no relevant information had been obtained during this time, so I guess they just decided it wasn't of great significance to them. Apparently, Ewen hadn't said a single incriminating thing, so they just washed their hands of it. However, that could provide invaluable information for the defense because it is kind of a major thing that he didn't say a single incriminating thing. The defense was livid. This demonstrated that the police had material they weren't disclosing to the defense, and even potentially the Crown and the prosecution, because the prosecution didn't even know about it. Not only that, but it also raised questions about what else the police could possibly be withholding. You don't get to just pick and choose which pieces of information or evidence you think is relevant to the investigation. Like, that's not the way this works. The police need to be an impartial party for our justice system to work. Another example occurred when the defence was petitioning to have the trial moved from Palmerston North to Wellington. This is because they did not believe that they would be able to find an impartial jury pool in Palmerston North. Paul Bass interviewed 13 people as part of their petition to see what they had heard about the Guy case. He then went back to them with their typed up affidavits for them to sign. One was someone who had spoken to the Guy family and wanted to make sure he had their permission before he signed the document. He later told Bass that an officer who had become aware he'd been approached by the defence had phoned him and persuaded him not to sign the document. To the defence, this could appear as a direct attempt to sabotage the fair trial process and to keep proceedings on their home turf in order to give them a competitive edge, which is ugly. Bass was quoted in response. It's very disconcerting that police should be ringing and trying to dissuade people from expressing an opinion when it comes to justice being done. That's bordering on perverting the course of justice, in my view, and it surprised me. But in the years I've been out of the police, it's very hard to surprise me now in regards to what lengths some officers will go to. There's a definite mindset in the police. There's a them and us attitude because they are always working in a negative environment, often talking to people who sit there and look at them in the face and tell them something, and then a couple of hours later, they'll finally admit they're lying. So you get a mindset that nobody can be trusted. Everyone's an asshole. Everyone's a liar. If we lock somebody up, they're guilty as sin. So as the trial date loomed nearer and Greg King finally arrived back in the country, he knew that despite all the efforts and everything they had to overcome with the police in the prosecution, their biggest difficulty would be convincing a jury to look beyond the other crimes that Ewen had committed. Quote, "It's never going to look good. It's never going to be something that anyone's going to say, well done, Ewen, for doing that. It's always going to be what it is, a terrible, stupid, and unbelievably nasty thing to do. But we've got to get across to the jury that, okay, that's a starting point for deliberations, but it's not the end point. You need to put it in its proper context, see it for what it is, and not let it overwhelm your objectivity." And frankly, there'll be some who'll think the arson and vandalism are enough to convict him. There'll be some who think it's suspicious, but not enough. There'll be some who think, what the hell's it got to do with the murder? That's just plain human dynamics. Now, prior to the trial, the court ruled in favour of the defence in omitting certain things from evidence pertaining to the different vandalisms and crimes that Ewen had committed. So that is where we're going to leave things for part 1 of the Scott Guy case. Stick around for part 2. It'll be coming very shortly. And it's got some shocking revelations, so I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're still here, leave me a black heart in the comments below to let me know you got to the end. Otherwise, I will see you in part 2. Okay? Bye.